Hello YouTube, Bane666 here, and I'm I'm really pissed, and by the end of this, no doubt you will be too. In this series, and it's probably going to be a long series because there's a lot to get through, I'm going to be dissecting some claims made about the men's rights movement by a channel called Knowing Better. Now, I first came across this channel, I think maybe 3 or 4 months ago, maybe 5 months ago, something like that. I watched some of his videos and I thought they were okay and they seemed fairly reasonable. He classed himself as a moderate, although it was pretty clear that he had some social justice leanings. But you know what? That's okay. I watch content from all types of people with all different opinions. So just because someone has some social justice leanings doesn't mean that I'm going to run away screaming, demanding a block bot to block them and escape to my echo chamber like certain people do. But yeah, I thought his content was okay. That is what I saw of it. And then 2 months ago, he put out a video called The Straight White Man's Guide to Feminism and Social Justice. Now, you may have seen Dr. Random McCam do a response to this video. I actually sent him the video when I watched it. I believe someone else did too. A couple of people did. But I didn't have time to go through the 40-minute video at that time. So I sent it off to Doc, and he did a fantastic job, as always, tearing apart his arguments. But having watched that video, it was pretty clear that Knowing Better just didn't have some social justice leanings. He had pretty much drank the Kool-Aid. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean in itself that he's a bad person or that he's always going to make bad arguments. But then we come up to this video called Taking on the Red Pill, Men's Rights Activism. After watching this, my opinion of Knowing Better changed dramatically, okay? It was pretty clear, having watched this, that this guy is a massive lying scumbag who really has no credibility. Think I'm over-exaggerating? Well, let's have a look at some quote mining he did later on in his video. Now, I know I'm jumping later on towards the end of his video, but I think it's important to establish exactly what type of person we're dealing with here. And I've got to say, when you take someone out of context like this, you lose all credibility. Anyway, here's the clip.
There are other factions, some of which are even creepier. Not all MRAs like them being around, but when one of the leaders of the men's rights movement says stuff like this...
If men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women, here's some of the way the world would look like. We would make rules that every woman would be sexual with us whenever we would like. And that the women who are very young, maybe 13 or 14, would be very interested in us.
It's kind of hard to deny that they are on this list.
Wow. Quote mining Warren Farrell to make him and Paul Elam look like pedophiles. You can't get much lower than that. This is the type of thing I would expect from Jenny McDermott or Bewildered Ape or Sale Polani to use some old names of some social justice advocates from a couple of years ago who would use very underhanded tactics like that. But really, you can't get any lower than quote mining someone to make out that they're a pedophile. And that's exactly what he's done here. Let's not mince our words in any way. He is making the claim that Warren Farrell is pro-pedophile and believes the world should be set up to sexually please men, that's women's roles, and that it's okay to sleep with 14-year-old girls. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. The type of person it would take to quote mine something like that and make that claim. Absolute fucking scumbag. Now, just in case you don't know much about Warren Farrell and maybe you think I'm overreacting and maybe you think that quote is somehow accurate, let me play the full quote from Warren Farrell. Okay, now it is a long quote, but I think it's important to play the entire clip for a number of reasons. Firstly, to prove that Warren Farrell does not believe that it's a woman's role to sexually please men and that's the way society should be set up and it's okay to sleep with 14-year-old girls, because That's not what he's saying, and it's abundantly clear when you watch this. Secondly, I want to show what type of person Warren Farrell actually is, because this is a pretty bad attack on his character. This is basically character assassination, and not just of Warren Farrell, but of the entire men's rights movement. And I believe in this clip, Warren Farrell does a fantastic job of actually explaining what we stand for. So that makes it even worse that he's chosen these 10 seconds to misrepresent us, because he actually would have had to watch the entire clip to find those 10 seconds and to see exactly what we do stand for. And then he's chosen to misrepresent that in the worst possible way, like an absolute fucking scumbag. I'm not going to pull any punches with this guy. That's exactly what he is. And there is a third reason I'm playing the long version of the clip, and that's because knowing better makes this claim in his video as well.
When men's rights groups bring up issues that are important to them and present their information, they don't bring up any serious solutions. Instead, they just conclude that therefore, feminism is wrong.
Now, if you've actually watched that clip with Warren Farrell, which you will in a minute, you see that Warren Farrell does offer solutions. And he is talking about solving problems. And he is talking about the issues that affect men and not just hating on women. But anyway, that's enough from me. Let's have a look at the clip and see it in its full context.
Basically, the world was not controlled by patriarchy. The world was controlled by the need to survive. And that need to survive has been common to all human beings throughout all of history. And the countries and the places where survival occurred, people figured out some type of usual division of labor. Usually in the more modern days, women raised children, men raised money. In the old days, women cooked the meals and risked their lives at childbirth. Men risked their lives in war to protect the children that women bore. And so, and both sexes neither sex had rights. Both sexes had obligations and responsibilities. When my father used to hear me at the beginning of the women's movement talk about women's rights, and then men's rights, and then gay rights, and then civil rights, he'd go, my goodness, when are you ever going to learn about responsibilities? What about obligations? What about duties? What about honor? Those are the things that you need to learn about as a male before you go from boy to man. And so when you look at it through the lens of survival, you realize that neither gender had rights. Both genders had responsibilities, both genders had obligations, both genders risked their lives in different ways. Both genders sacrificed their lives for their children. Why did they do that? Probably partially biologically, that's the only way you got another generation, but also when you talk to men and women qualitatively, they both say exactly the same thing. I'm making these sacrifices in the hope, with the dream, that my children will have a better life than I had. That's the inspiration. That's the motivation. That's common to both sexes. And when gender studies only looks at one part of the scale, then here's what happens. The women's movement has done a wonderful thing, and that is expanded options for women. But let's look at that as if the world were a family boat and men and women were both in the same family boat. In this family boat, in the old days, men rowed from the right side, raise money. Women learned you row from the left side of the boat, raise children. The women's movement, after divorces occurred, said, wait a minute, we want women to have the options and the ability to row from both sides of the boat, raise children and raise money. This was, in my opinion, something to be applauded. But nobody said to men, you need to be honored as much for raising children as for raising money. We need to not only train you and socialize you to raise children effectively, we need to honor you and respect you, and we need to encourage our daughters to fall in love with you if you're raising children as well as raising money. Then we would have both sexes able to row from both sides of the boat. Now, right now, what we have is women able to row from both sides of the boat, but if a man becomes unemployed, he can't row from both sides of the boat. So we have, so the boat gets rowed on just one side, and a boat that gets rowed on just one side is a boat that goes in circles. A boat that goes in circles is far more vulnerable to the rocks of recessions, and it sinks. So when either sex wins, both sexes lose. Gender studies as of today is only about one sex as if that one sex were a victim. For universities not to have every possible way of looking at gender, the male way, the female way, the conservative male way, the conservative female way, the liberal male way, the liberal female way, all of that has to be part of the gender mix. Gay male way, gay female ways, transgender ways. We have to open up and look at and not condemn before we even speak. The women's movement's gender studies programs has looked at the world through the spectrum of women's experience of powerlessness and women's experience of what they think is male power. They haven't looked at the world from men's experience of powerlessness and men's experience of what the power of women's beauty or youth is, or sexuality is, or sexual withdrawal is, or emotional ability to support them or not support them is. And that's the male experience of female power. But that's not the female experience of female power or powerlessness. So you have to look at the world from multiple areas of examination. You have to see the male experience of male powerlessness, the male experience of female powerlessness and power, the female experience of power and powerlessness, and the female experience of male power and powerlessness. And then you add things like class and other things to that. Then you have a discussion that helps everybody in the university understand her or himself and feel heard. But to have a discussion that is just from one perspective and call that a university, that insults the very concept of what freedom of speech, intellectual curiosity. Some people say I know more about men than anybody in the world, but I cannot get a job at any major university in the United States in the gender studies area, the area I know the most about, because I am not politically correct. And that's very sad. And so patriarchy is not the filter through which is not the only defining filter of men and women. If men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women, here's some of the way the world would look like. We would make rules that every woman would be sexual with us whenever we would like. And that the women who are very young, maybe 13 or 14, would be very interested in us. That we would be, that when we were, that we would die, we have a longer life expectancy than women, that the world would be set up in such a way that we would not be the sex to commit suicide. We would be the sex to least be likely to commit suicide. The world would be set up in such a way that we would have women pay for us on dates because they valued us more than we valued them. And so that we would have women take the sexual initiatives and risk rejection, and we would sit back and say yes or no, depending on whether we wanted to or not. We would, if a woman went too far too quickly, we could yell date rape, but she couldn't, and she would be, she would have to wait until she was proved herself innocent, rather than the other way around. We would have men's studies classes and not women's studies classes. We would have women have to be the primary breadwinner and earn more money because the road to high pay is a toll road. It costs and it takes a lot out of somebody to work very hard. We would have three options when the children are born: the option to raise the children, the option to be involved in the workplace, or the option to do some combination of both. women would have just one option, the option to raise money, or raise money. And then we would feel free to blame them if they raised more money and feel free to reject them if they didn't raise enough money. That's the way a patriarchy would look like. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what it would look like. We would have female-only draft registration and not male-only draft registration. Men would have the option to join the armed services, but not the obligation to join the armed services, the option to go to combat, but not the expectation to go to combat. That's the way a world would look like if it was a patriarchy.
So what we have here is an 8 or 9 minute long clip of Warren Farrell talking about gender roles and about how, thanks to feminism, women have far more freedom when it comes to gender roles, and that men should have that same freedom, right? I mean, isn't that what we hear from feminists all the time, that gender roles are bad? Well, Warren Farrell is saying that men need that same freedom, that gender roles for men need to be pulled down as well. He then goes on to debunk patriarchy theory and explains in great detail that if we did live in a patriarchy the way feminists believe we do, there would be numerous consequences. And he goes through a long list of different things, like women being forced to join the draft and men not, and women paying on dates, etc., etc. So Knowing Better has ignored all of that and instead has chosen to take a 10-second clip out of context to try to make it sound like Warren Farrell is into 13-year-old pussy. Now you know why I am so pissed off, right? Now you know why I think this guy is a massive fucking scumbag, despite his nice guy persona. As far as I'm concerned, after this, that's just an act. And I'm happy to say that I am going to go through the entire 30 minutes of his video with a fine-tooth comb. I'm going to point out every single mistake, every lie, every time he misrepresents statistics, every little thing he gets wrong. Because this guy is a fucking scumbag. And he deserves to be exposed for exactly what he is. And just let me repeat once more. When you pull tricks like this, your credibility is gone, okay? When you lie and misrepresent someone by taking them out of context like this, that is the end of your credibility. Gone, as far as I'm concerned. I can understand people making mistakes. I can understand people having an ideological bias. To some degree, everyone does. And when you make content like mine, you have to try to be aware of that bias and to understand your opponent's arguments and to give them a fair chance. And that's not always easy because, like I said, everyone has their own bias, right? Everyone has their own worldview from their subjective point of view, which is why you always have to be on guard about that stuff. So I can understand some people making mistakes. I can understand some people being influenced by their belief system. But this isn't that. This isn't a mistake. This is a deliberate misrepresentation. This is an entirely different thing than a mistake or being slightly biased. This is fucking deception. So, without any further delay, let's jump right into his video.
If you've spent any amount of time discussing politics with just about anyone, you've likely come across the argument known as a whataboutism. Even if you've never heard of the term, you know what it is. Usually it has very little to do with the original topic and just aims to derail the conversation. Oh, you want to fill that pothole? Well, what about fixing the sidewalks on my street? Oh, so you care about
terrible tragedy.
Well, I didn't see you complaining during
other unrelated terrible tragedy.
You've heard these arguments before and they're somewhat easy to spot. But what do you do when the counter-argument seems to directly contradict whatever it is you're advocating for?
Now, I do find this start of his video to be incredibly ironic because his entire video about the men's rights movement is almost entirely whataboutism. That is, when he's not quote mining and things like that. So basically what he does is he'll bring up a men's rights issue, he'll admit that there is some validity to it, and then he'll say, but what about the women's, right? That's basically his repetitive argument throughout the entire video. And he does this just as a dismissal tool for the men's rights issue. Now, the perfect example of this is when he brings up male suicide, which he admits is a problem, and then says, but more women attempt it. Yeah, because we've never heard that one before, have we? Now, I have two issues with this particular argument. The first one being it's simply not true, and I will get to that later on when I reach that part of the video and go through it with more detail. But the other reason why I have an issue with it is because you're comparing dead men to living women and somehow saying that's equivalent. That's not a great argument. But then again, that's pretty typical of this video, as we're about to see. So let's continue.
Oh, so you made a video about feminism? Well, what about men's rights?
Fucking asshole. I mean, what else can I say? The asshole is dressed up as Aurini when he's doing a video about MRAs. What a fucking asshole. Now, you'll note the fedora, the glass of alcohol, and the skull in the background, right? This is clearly meant to be Davis Aurini, who just so happens to not be an MRA.
The bulk of the MRA movement, the center of gravity of the MRA movement, however, is as left as anything comes.
Not every MRA is in the alt-right, but some of them are.
The MRA movement is not a herd of bulls. It's a herd of steers. Real men do not form movements. We go our own way, whatever that way might be. Occasionally we'll come together to accomplish a particular goal. Mises Institute. Goal is to distribute intelligent literature and have conversations about it. So it sticks around, but it has no policy effect.
Can I just say, fuck you for making me watch Davis Aurini. I fucking hate Davis Aurini. He just rambles on about absolute bullshit, and he's constantly going off on tangents. It's painful to listen to him. This was painful to try to find the bits where he's actually talking about MRAs in a video about MRAs. Most of it, he's just rambling about other shit, which has nothing to do with anything. So, yeah, thank you for making me do that, you fucking asshole.
Whereas the MRAs are precisely that. They're a bunch of pussies crying for attention. They got screwed over in a divorce. And, you know, my heart goes out to any guy that gets screwed over. But, again, as I believe it was No Man that said this, the writing's on the wall. If you're getting married in this day and age, and she divorces you, you didn't do your damn homework.
Okay, so we have a situation here where we have two assholes, right? We have a left-wing asshole and a right-wing asshole. Now, the left-wing asshole thinks that we mainly lean to the right and we're not interested in equality, and that's a bad thing. Whereas the right-wing asshole thinks we mainly lean to the left and we are interested in equality, which is a bad thing. Now, the left-wing asshole thinks that the right-wing asshole represents us. And the right-wing asshole would think that the left-wing asshole represents us if he had seen the left-wing asshole, that is. So, no, Davis Aurini does not represent us. He has never called himself a men's rights activist. He has never been concerned about men's issues.
They're a bunch of pussies.
He has never supported men's rights or men's rights activists. He has never turned up at a men's rights event. And generally speaking, MRAs don't fucking like him. So it is ironic that you would pick him to represent us, right? Yeah, I guess you're not trying to create a piece of propaganda at all, right? Nah. Next.
Men and women are biologically and psychologically different. I don't know any serious person who disputes that.
I don't know any serious person who disputes that. That's an interesting statement. Of course, he's forgetting large portions of feminism, in particular second-wave feminism, who would argue that the differences between men and women are just social constructs, apart from the obvious physical differences when it comes to reproduction. Although there are even some feminists, and admittedly they are somewhat rare, but there are some feminists who even believe that the physical size differences between men and women comes down to men historically being given better food and therefore being able to grow stronger. Of course, this is a fucking insane argument, one which just doesn't understand basic biology and evolution. And of course, there are also many feminists who hate evolutionary psychology. Now, to be perfectly fair, there are people on the other side of politics who do misuse evolutionary psychology and take it to the opposite extreme. But I'm of the opinion you shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because some assholes take it to an extreme and misuse it doesn't mean that there aren't valid concepts within the actual science. But to be perfectly fair, not all feminists believe this. And clearly knowing better is not one of those feminists. So I'm not going to judge him by the standards of others. So let's go on.
And while you can't say that men or women are better overall, you can say that when it comes to specific categories on average, like upper body strength, pain tolerance, or color perception. Because of those inherent differences, men and women have taken on different roles in our society. These societal gender roles have made men and women culturally different as well. Much like the biological and psychological differences, you can't say that men or women are culturally better overall. But again, you can say it when it comes to specific categories. Over the last century, women have been trying to break out of those traditional gender roles with a good deal of success. They aren't quite there yet, but I already made a video about that. Instead, this video is about men who've been watching women successfully getting out of their roles and saying, hey, we want to get out of our traditional gender roles too.
Isn't that a good thing? Shouldn't we be supported by the feminist movement? Yet we get videos like this one with dishonest quote mining and comparing us to Davis Aurini. Yeah.
These men are typically known as men's rights activists, or MRAs. They're part of the broader manosphere, and they've become pretty popular in recent decades for reasons we'll get to later. A few years ago, they released a documentary called The Red Pill, named after the red pill in the Matrix, which makes you wake up and see the horrible reality of the world, as opposed to the blue pill, which is feminism in this case.
Okay, so the red pill is a metaphor. It means waking up and seeing reality for what it really is, or seeing a reality that you had previously missed or didn't know about. And this describes Cassie J's journey while making the documentary perfectly, right? Because at the start of it, she wasn't aware of men's issues. She saw the world through the feminist lens. She saw women as oppressed and men as the privileged ones who were oppressing women. And it was lucky to be a man, because men had everything going for them, and women were the ones which faced hardship, unlike the lucky men. But during her journey, she managed to open her eyes and see that men have issues too, and realize that the feminist narrative of the world is actually false. The red pill metaphor is perfect for her journey. Now, it is a metaphor, so it can be used in other ways, of course. Maybe you were raised in a religious family and you took the red pill and became an atheist, for example. But from an MRA perspective, it's used to say men have issues too. It really is that simple.
Go to the doctor and you ask for the blue pill, you're gonna get something very different. In the movie, they say that one of the defining characteristics of men's role in society is the concept of male disposability.
Every society that survived based on its ability to train its sons to be disposable. Disposable in war as warriors, disposable in work as firefighters, as workers on oil rigs and so on, coal miners.
Male disposability is the idea that men are seen as less valuable and therefore disposable for the betterment or preservation of society, which is why men account for most deaths in the workplace. The film makes it a point to mention how many people died on the job and what percentage of those deaths were men. In 2017, it actually increased to 5,147 workplace fatalities, 92.5% of which were men. Just to put that into perspective, that's more casualties than the entire Iraq War, all 7 years put together every year. So this is a genuine problem worth talking about. The most dangerous profession when it comes to how many deaths there are per worker is fishermen. If you've ever watched The Deadliest Catch, you'd know that. But the most dangerous profession when it comes to absolute numbers is truck driver, with almost 1,000 deaths in 2017, more than the next 10 professions combined. Why aren't these the jobs we talk about when discussing male disposability? The red pill mentioned coal miners, oil drillers, and firefighters.
Now, I want you to take note. He mentions firefighters, oil drillers, and coal miners.
Even the watch commercial responding to Gillette uses firefighters when quoting the same statistic. Only 35 firefighters died on the job in 2017. Don't get me wrong, I wish it was 0, but these aren't the guys dying by the hundreds. These are. Why aren't truck drivers the face of male disposability? Because they aren't heroic.
Okay, so there are a number of issues with his argument here. First of all, let's deal with the heroic argument, right? He's making the insinuation that MRAs are only focusing on firefighters because they're heroic, and they're not really concerned about men dying. They're just concerned about, I don't know, presenting men as heroic or something like that. But he's totally forgotten that just minutes ago he mentioned oil drillers and coal miners. Two professions which I don't really see as heroic. I don't think there's a lot of little kids who want to grow up to be a coal miner. He also compares the number of firefighters who die to the number of truck drivers who die. And yes, it is true, more truck drivers die than firefighters. But there are vastly more truck drivers than firefighters. So looking up the stats for truck drivers in the US, there are 3.5 million. As for firefighters, they're really divided into two categories. First of all, there are the career firefighters, so there are basically around 350,000 of them. And then there are the volunteer firefighters, with almost 800,000. So the volunteer firefighters are risking their lives without any financial compensation, which I think is also a factor that should be taken into account. Yes, truck drivers are more likely to die on the roads, but at least they're getting paid for their job. They're not risking their lives to save others for no financial compensation. He also doesn't take into account the long-term effects of being a firefighter. They have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and often come in contact with a number of carcinogens when combating fires. And truck drivers tend to be on the road a lot longer than firefighters tend to be fighting fires. So these things do increase the number of truck drivers who die compared to the number of firefighters who die. But which of the two professions do you think is safer from an individual perspective? Would you prefer to drive a truck for an hour or to go into a burning building for an hour?
Even when discussing the plight of men dying in the workforce, we want to be seen as hyper-masculine and heroic.
Okay, so let me explain the men's rights position again, and Warren Farrell's position. It's pretty simple. As we saw in that clip from Warren Farrell at the start, women have many options when it comes to gender roles. They can be a stay-at-home mum, they can have a career, or they can have a combination of the two. But when it comes to men, it's a bit different. As Warren Farrell says, men have three options also. They can provide the money, or alternatively, they can provide the money. And basically, men are locked into this protector-provider role. Now, it is slowly changing, but it hasn't changed as fast as women's roles did. So because the male identity is locked into this protector-provider role, that means that men are more willing to do the dangerous or shitty jobs. and there is also a societal expectation for men to do the dangerous or shitty jobs. And society doesn't really give a shit that men are doing those dangerous or shitty jobs. It doesn't appreciate the sacrifice of men. A good example of this is we constantly hear how hard it is to be a mother. It's an extremely hard thing, but who cares about the dad who sacrifices time from his family doing a shitty job that he doesn't like and possibly is even dangerous to provide money for his family, possibly working overtime or on weekends or holidays, possibly never seeing his kids grow up. And of course this is used against him later on when he gets divorced. Society doesn't really take that sacrifice into account. So what Warren Farrell and MRAs like myself think is we should not only appreciate what men do and the sacrifices men make, but we should also expand those gender roles. Now, I would think this is a fairly easy thing to understand if you have seen that clip I played of Warren Farrell at the start. And clearly, knowing better has seen that clip, because he found that 10 seconds to quote mine. So, obviously he's watched the entire thing. Obviously he knows what our position is, what the argument is. So he can't plead ignorance. This isn't a misunderstanding, which we see all the time from people just like him who assume our position without actually listening to what we're saying and then respond to that straw man. No, he obviously knows our position and is purposely misrepresenting it. And that's exactly what he's doing here. He's reduced what I've just said down to MRAs are promoting hypermasculinity, which we're not. Talking about firefighting being a dangerous job is not promoting hypermasculinity. It's saying men sacrifice for society, and that needs to be taken into account and appreciated. I don't think that's a big ask. And the interesting thing is, when I've heard Warren Farrell talk about this before, when he's been talking about dangerous or dirty and shitty jobs, he's also mentioned things like garbage collectors. Now, it is true in recent times, in many places, that jobs become a lot cleaner. You know, people sit in a truck and press a button, but that's a more recent development. Traditionally, it's been a pretty dirty, shitty job, which requires you to get up early in the morning, which is not fun in the middle of winter. And you then have to go out in the cold and confront smelly, dirty fucking garbage. So, yeah, I've heard Warren Farrell mention that as a way that some men sacrifice to provide for their family. Now, I wouldn't consider being a garbage man to be an example of hypermasculinity or a glamorous job. But knowing better doesn't really care about the arguments. He doesn't care about the facts. He's just interested in spinning a narrative which undermines the men's rights movement and also undermines men's issues.
There's nothing heroic about this. Truck drivers are seen as some of the lowest people in society because, well, you know those Gatorade bottles you've seen thrown out on the side of the highway? Yeah, those aren't filled with Gatorade. Disgusting! So instead they go with firefighter, which I find interesting because that profession in particular is one that women have been trying to get into for decades. But
okay, I'll deal with women wanting to become firefighters in a minute, but first I really need to deal with this notion that Warren Farrell and MRAs in general only focus on the heroic firefighters and not the downtrodden truck driver, because MRAs are only interested in heroic men and hypermasculinity and don't see the little guy or some bullshit like this. Now, the interesting thing is he started out quoting truck driver, oil driller, and coal miner, and then he dropped those last two, as if he had never mentioned them. How strange. How very, very strange. But what's even more interesting is that Warren Farrell has talked about truck drivers before. In fact, he talks about them rather extensively in his book, The Myth of Male Power. Let me read you some quotes. We frequently hear that women are segregated into low-paying dead-end jobs in poor work environments such as factories. But when the Jobs Rated Almanac 2 rated 250 jobs from best to worst based on a combination of salary, stress, work environment, outlook, security, and physical demands, they found that 24 of the 25 worst jobs were almost all male jobs. Some examples: truck driver, sheet metal worker, roofer, boiler maker, lumberjack, carpenter, construction worker or foreman, construction machinery operator, football player, welder, millwright, iron worker. All of these jobs have one thing in common: 95 to 100% men. He also does a list of hazardous occupations. Firefighter, 99% male. Logging, 98% male. Trucking, heavy, 98% male. Construction, 98% male. Coal mining, 97% male. How strange he mentions truck driving, considering, apparently those people are unseen by us because it's not glamorous, heroic, or hyper-masculine. But there's more. As I stopped by Von's supermarket for some grapefruit juice, I waited for a huge truck to back into the narrow delivery space. It was a familiar scene, but it was only as I had become aware of how truckers' scheduling demands sometimes lead to their falling asleep at the wheel, making their death rate among the highest of any profession, that I registered the cup of coffee he was slugging down. In the process, I saw more than a truck blocking my entrance into the parking lot. I saw a man in the truck. I visualized a trucker on his 8th cup of coffee at 4 a.m., stretching his limits so I can eat my limit without paying to my limit. But there's more. I thought, how had I been more likely to associate trucking with Teamsters and the death caused by a truck accident rather than the deaths caused to the truckers? The difference in my feeling towards him turned a moment's wait into a moment's appreciation. I smiled at him with a warmth that must have been different because he returned the smile as if he felt the appreciation. And there's a lot more where Warren Farrell's talking about truck drivers in the myth of male power, but he also talks about garbage collectors. As I prepared to leave the house, I heard the roar of the garbage truck. Usually that just triggers the, oh yeah, it's Monday. This time it also triggered my memory that the garbage man was 2.5 times more likely to be killed than a police officer. Yes, that hypermasculine job, garbage collector. And that 70% of the collection crew of the city of San Diego, where I live, suffered job-related injuries in the last year alone. And as I saw the garbage man pull up to my garbage, I connected the 70% figure to this man, to his disproportionate chance of back injuries, hernia, rectal cancer, cirrhosis of the liver, or just being hit by a passing automobile. I saw some things I hadn't seen before. First, just the lumbar support belt one of the men was wearing, then eye contact, then a name I had never bothered to ask. So this is basically Warren Farrell discussing how he was red-pilled, how he saw things that he hadn't seen before, how he opened his eyes to the other side. And he continues a little bit later. Why was I so unaware of these dangers? In part because these men never speak up. Instead, they turn each other's misfortune into humour, calling each other the cyanide man, the radioactive man, and so on. And in part, we are more conscious of the injuries of the football player, for example, because the absence of the football player has an impact on our egos. It makes our team lose. If our garbage man dies, he is replaced like any part on the garbage truck. So this is the exact opposite of what Knowing Better is arguing. This is the exact opposite of what Knowing Better is strawmanning our position into.
With firefighter, which I find interesting because that profession in particular is one that women have been trying to get into for decades, but have been kept out for reasons. Probably because we all imagine women as these little 90-pound frail objects. But if Zarya wants to be a firefighter, I say let her.
Okay, before we go on, just let me state my position on this particular topic. As long as someone can meet the physical and mental requirements for the job, I'm happy for them to do that job. I don't care what biological sex you are, what gender you are, I don't care what colour your skin is, what religion you are, what political party you belong to, or anything like that. Just so long as you can meet the requirements, okay? So, yes, I agree with knowing better here that women should become firefighters if they can meet the requirements. And I think the vast majority of MRAs would agree with me.
We're the ones dying, and we die for you guys.
You don't get to say that we're the ones dying and we're doing it for you in jobs you want, but you can't have because they're ours.
Now, I've watched the Red Pill movie numerous times, and at no point does anyone say, women aren't allowed to become firefighters, those jobs are ours. And clearly that's not the MRA position. Look, all he was asking in that clip was that you acknowledge and appreciate men's sacrifice, instead of demonizing us and constantly saying that our lives are privileged. And maybe give us more choice, okay? That's all. It's a simple fucking thing to understand. I can't understand why people like you can't get it through your head. Let me take that back. I do understand why. It's called feminism.
Women want those dangerous jobs, and as long as they're kept out of them, we as men don't get to complain that we're stuck with them.
Okay, so he flashes up a statistic here. It's got, out of New York City's 10,000 firefighters, only 58 were female in 2015. That's 0.5% total. Okay, for the sake of argument, I'm just going to assume that that statistic is correct. It doesn't really change my argument one way or the other. So he's making 2 points here. First of all, women want these jobs, and second of all, that women are kept out of these jobs. Well, my first question would be, what percentage of women want these jobs? Is the percentage of women wanting to be firefighters the same percentage of men who want to be firefighters? Because if there's 100 people applying to be firefighters and 99 of them are men and one is female, then obviously the end result is going to be more male firefighters. But for some reason, I think you're assuming that it's 50-50 because you expect a 50-50 outcome, which is strange. And of course, even if it was 50-50 applying for the job of firefighter, that doesn't mean that you'd have a 50-50 result at the other end of that. Because as Knowing Better himself pointed out earlier,
you can say that when it comes to specific categories on average, like upper body strength, pain tolerance, or color perception. Because of those inherent differences, men and women have taken on different roles in our society.
So if there are less women applying for the position of firefighter, and admittedly that is an assumption on my part, but I think it's a pretty safe assumption. And also, men have a greater chance of succeeding because men, on average, have more body strength, therefore are more likely to meet the physical requirements. Then that explains why there are less women in firefighting. But Knowing Better makes the claim that women are kept out of firefighting, and he specifically shows us statistics from New York City. So let's examine that. Let's see if female firefighters are kept out of the firefighting departments in New York City. So here's an article from 2015. Firefighter who flunked physical, injured 10 days into job. Can you guess what particular gender she was? Woman to become New York firefighter despite failing crucial fitness test. A woman who failed FDNY physical test 6 times gets another chance. Now, these are 3 different women who have all failed their physicals but have been accepted regardless. Now, this is not something that would happen to a male in that position. So, I'm not exactly sure how you can argue that women are being kept out of the New York Fire Department when the opposite seems to be true. And in fact, the New York Fire Department has lowered the physical requirements of their entrance exam specifically to allow more women in. So once again, this is the exact opposite of what you're arguing. And I should now point out that Knowing Better has turned a conversation about male disposability into one of discrimination against females. What exactly did he call that technique again? It seems to have slipped my memory. Of course, this is just the standard distraction technique used by feminists. Whenever an MRA brings up a talking point, if they can't dismiss it outright, they acknowledge it, then try to downplay it, and then start talking about how it's always worse for women. And I think I'll end it there for now because this video is already quite long and he's starting to talk about the military. So I'll leave that till next episode. And don't worry, there is plenty more debunking to go. I'm only about 5 minutes into his 30-minute video, so I might do 1 or 2 of these a month until I'm completely through it.
The entire men's rights advocate thing, it's a left-wing phenomenon. They want us to organize and all sign petitions and scream and whine and cry at government. And at the same time, they reject traditional authority. They reject traditional gender roles. These gender roles that are based in biology, that are intelligent, civilized add-on to biology so that we can express our animalistic urges in a civilized manner. No, they reject that. They want perfect equality between the sexes. They're angry right now because the female sex is on top, and they want the male sex to be on top. Or at least equal. They want what feminists were talking about in the 1970s, actual gender equality. And of course, where does equality come from? Because inequality comes from nature, equality can only come from the state. So thank God for Big Brother making us all equal, bringing us peace and comfort so long as we have an eternal war. It's going to be against Iran in a few months.